Welcome to Road to Rapid episode 7. And because the chess.com rapid algorithm loves to give me the white pieces, I'm back with white. So I go for e4, my opponent plays c5, the Sicilian, and rather than go into bishop b5, the canal attack, I decided to go for d4, and we go into the Najdorf. And I decided here to go for bishop g5, a pretty aggressive approach to the Najdorf. And now queen d2, preparing to castle long. And so I do. And these moves are all pretty standard, but now typically the move you'll see is something like knight to c6 or knight to d7, but my opponent immediately started a flank attack with b5. And this kind of got me thinking, a lot of times I want to play f4 here, but if I do immediately, then he can play b4. And now I'm losing this pawn because the knight's going to have to move away, which would be pretty bad. And here I play bishop d3, and it looks like a pretty decent spot for the bishop. It's on a diagonal that is hitting this pawn where black is going to eventually castle, but behind this pawn, you're going to see the bishop is going to have a very hard time. And so my opponent played bishop b7, putting another attacker here. And now again, I have to play f3 because otherwise I'm in jeopardy of losing this pawn. So now he develops his knight, and I just move my king to b1, just a good prophylactic move to get it off the c-file and get it into a more stable spot. And now he castles. And here I played g4. I'm already looking to start a kingside attack, and I was a little bit wary that if I played h4, he could just stop me with h5, and this would make it very difficult for me to progress. So I played g4 with the idea to create a pawn storm here. But of course, my opponent is going to do the same, and he jumps in with knight c5. And like I said, the bishop already having a hard time. Now it's under attack. Its days are numbered. And so I just continued with the plan, pushed h4. And my opponent played b4, attacking my knight. Has to go back, of course. And here he played a5. And as you can see, it's becoming a race to see who can break through with their pawns and start attacking their enemy king first. And here, my bishop is at this point kind of in the way of my pawns advancing, so I decided to take his knight. And after bishop takes, play this move g5, attacking the bishop with tempo. Of course, he has to go back. And here, although my attack looks pretty promising with these two pawns here that are getting closer to the king, it's actually pretty tricky to continue the attack, especially with him launching his attack at the same time. The move I ended up playing was knight to g3, and here my opponent played queen b6. And now I played h5, thinking that I was pretty close to breaking through. Next move would be g6, but now he grabbed my bishop with his knight, and I'm forced to recapture the queen, because if I take with the pawn, it leaves my knight hanging. And what I didn't realize is that once the queen moves away, pawn's not defended anymore, and he just jumps in and takes it. So that's tough. I'm down a pawn now, and my attack just got cut short a little bit. And once again, my time situation here was not the best, and I saw that my attack was quickly running out of steam, but I was not giving up there. So I decided to sacrifice another pawn. Well, I blundered the first one, but I'm sacrificing this one to kickstart my attack. And so he took, and now queen to f3, attacking his bishop. And here he retreated his bishop, and again, I'm in a really tight spot here. I have two knights in return for his two bishops, and it's really tough to see how I'm going to break through with just this one remaining pawn. And here I realized that I was in a lot of trouble. My knight is now under attack twice. If it goes back, he's simply going to continue with a pawn storm with something like a4, and this is going to be really bad for me. There's not much I can do in terms of attacking his king, but on the contrary, there's a lot he can do to attack my king. So instead of go down that slow, painful path, I decided to make a very questionable decision, at least in the computer's eyes, and play knight to f5. Kind of a desperate move because I'm losing my knight, but at least now the knight is pretty close to his king. It can jump into here with check. It's also putting pressure here. I felt like maybe I could get something going and surprise my opponent if he wasn't being careful. So he just continued with his plan, actually sacrificing this pawn, which I have to take. And now he drove in with his queen, now lining up two attackers against my pawn here. So I played c4, and now he comes in with this pawn. And in a matter of moves, he's going to be very close to my king. So I have to act fast. I attacked him with h6, and he now doesn't want his pawn to get captured, so he played g6. And you can see I at least drew some kind of concession because now this pawn attacks the square. Maybe I might have some kind of checkmate ideas in the future. So here's knight to e7 check and king to h8. And here the sad thing for me is that if only this bishop was gone, I would actually have this queen to f6 checkmate. But the good thing for him is his bishop is very well positioned, both attacking and defending at the same time. And running out of time, I even considered a complete desperate move like rook h5, hoping that maybe he would ignore my rook and play something like a3, and then I could sacrifice the rook and deliver checkmate. But there's just simply no way a player this strong would allow this. He would simply take the rook and stare at his computer like, is this guy out of his mind? So I decided not to do that, but rather I played rook to d3, making sure I wouldn't at least lose this pawn. And now here my opponent is storming through with a3, looking to maybe take here or advance the pawn, and he's getting closer to my king with every move. So I played rook to f1, just trying to do something active, get this rook more into the game. And this is where my opponent kind of botched his attack. All he really needs to do is take this pawn and open up this rook, and my king would be driven out. There's really not much I can do in terms of attacking. His pieces are perfectly placed to defend. If I were to just make some kind of move, maybe like rook g1, just wait it out, he would come in with check. And after king here, he could even bring in backup. And after me making a slow move, maybe like queen e3, he could already take here. And then after takes, bishop takes, he's just completely ripping through my defenses, and he would eventually checkmate me. But unfortunately for him, I think he got a little carried away. He just played a2, check, not realizing that I could just go here. And now we have a rare situation in the game where I'm able to actually use his piece as leverage to defend my own king. His pawn has actually gone too far, and it's now stopping his rook from breaking through. This is not ideal for him, but he's definitely still winning at this point. What he could have just done was play queen to a3 and threaten this checkmate. I can't take his queen because the pawn is pinned by the bishop, and eventually he would just overload. And now here he played the incredible bishop takes b2 check, and after my king takes, queen to a3, and after my king jumped back to a1, he immediately realized that he had completely botched this attack, because he sacrificed the bishop only for my king to return to where it was, and now he has a glaring mate threat on f6. For example, if he were to just make a slow move like queen to b4, I would win the game on the spot. So of course he covered the threat, at least with f6. Over the last 3 moves, I've gone from hopelessly losing to now back in the game with even maybe a chance to win. But my time is running very low. I played queen to f4, which is actually not the best move. With a move like queen to e3, I would have maybe even had a chance to fight for a win, because here my queen threatens to infiltrate his camp. But under time pressure, I just played queen f4 because this move looked good enough for me to attack the pawn. And he now attacked my knight. Knight jumps back. And now he takes. I take. But this now opens up the file for his rook to infiltrate. And he comes here, threatening checkmate, which fortunately I saw and played rook to d2. And here my opponent played for a little bit of a trick with the move g5, attacking my queen, which is tied to the defense of the rook. And if I would just carelessly move the queen away, he could take. But of course I knew this and just played queen to d4. But immediately after I did this, I thought that I missed an opportunity with queen takes g5, which seems like a crazy move. I'm giving up my queen, but after pawn takes, I would checkmate. So I was frustrated that I missed this move, but when I went back and looked at it, I realized that this is a trap. And if I were to take, he would have this rook to e1 check, forcing me to take the rook, and then he would take my queen. So luckily I didn't fall into the trick and just played queen d4, and we traded rooks. And at this point, he's still up a pawn, but the position is not clear. He can't directly break through to my king, but he did take my pawn. And now I played queen to d4, attacking here. He now moved out of the way. And now if I were to take here, I would be in a lot of trouble because queen to b1 is checkmate. So I played the only move I saw that could allow me to counterattack with queen to a7, threatening queen to g7 mate. And so he started a long sequence of checking my king, which I carefully had to duck, because if I were to move the king, say here, he could play queen to c5 and force a trade of queens, and here he would be almost completely winning. And on the other hand, if I were to move, for example, back to b1, he could take the rook with check, and it would be game over. So I carefully navigated with my king, not allowing him to take my rook with check or forcing a trade. And also, for example, if I were to put my king here, he could then come in with the rook, and my king would be close to getting checkmated. So I simply played the most careful moves with my king, and eventually he brought his queen back to the defense of the square. And again, I had very little time. I just brought in my queen, looking to maybe win this pawn back. He played f5, which is a little bit of a mistake. It allows me to trade the queens off, and now I have this pass pawn. But still, at this point, I've been playing all these past maybe 5-10 moves with less than a minute on the clock, and I realized that there's very little chance that I can win this game. But maybe I'd be able to complicate things enough to cause him to slip up. And here he played f4 because he now has 2 connected pass pawns that he's going to try to queen. And I played e7, attacking his rook, distracting it, forcing him to go here, and now rook to g1, attacking this pawn. So he took my pawn and I took his with check, and he played king to f8. At this point, I have only 1 pawn against his 3, which doesn't look very promising, but until it's over, I'm going to continue to fight. So I played my rook back to g2, looking to get in front of this pawn, and he played king to f7, and now I brought my king in. And he's advancing with this pawn. My rook goes here, but his rook comes in to defend, and now I went after his pawn on d6. He simply defended it, and now I realized I had one last shot to maybe create some kind of tricky counterplay. Otherwise, he's just going to force a trade of rooks and promote this pawn. For example, with a move like king to d4, he's just going to bring his rook over here, and eventually his king is going to come in this way, and it's going to be game over for me. So I played the move rook to a2, looking to maneuver the rook onto this side of the board and go after this pawn. So he just played rook to e2. Obviously, a trade would be in his favor, because now he queens on the next move. So I played rook to a7 check, king moves, and I grab this pawn. And now I have my own pass pawn, but is it going to be in time? He plays f2, and now rook to h8, a trick move. If he promotes immediately, then I have this game-saving move, rook to f8, and after king e7, I pick up his queen. But of course, he saw this and played king to f7, and now I move my pawn up. And he promoted here. And now, this was what I was counting on. I played the last desperate Hail Mary shot, rook to f8 check, with the idea that if he takes my rook, I can promote to my queen, and although he has a queen and a rook, and I just have a queen, maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to perpetual check him and force a draw, which in hindsight, it's clear to see that I simply would not be able to do this, because after king e7 and maybe a couple more checks, he could just block it with his queen, and then after this check, he blocks and delivers his check. And after a trade of queens, I'm just completely losing. But I guess at this point, my opponent forgot that his queen was on the same file as my rook. And so he did not actually take the rook, but rather moved his king to e7, which totally and completely blunders the game, because now I took his queen. And after rook to h2, he actually offered me a draw, and I accepted, realizing that there's no way I can win this. But there's also no way he can win this, because now if I play rook to a1, he can't take my pawn, because now I come in with rook a7 and win his rook. So, but at the same time, my pawn is never going to queen, and his pawn is never going to push, so it's just a deadlock, which neither of us are going to be able to progress from. So I think the main takeaway from this game is that simply neither of us were good enough to win. My opponent played well in the beginning, but was not able to find the correct moves when it mattered most, and I played poorly in the beginning, but then was able to create enough counterplay that it kind of threw my opponent off and stopped him from being able to break through. And this is actually the first rapid game that I drew in probably over like 30 or 40 games. Every rapid game that I played over the past several weeks has had a decisive result, whether I lose or I win. So at least this is an interesting change of events to have it be a draw. So not the best performance for me, but I was able to at least miraculously rescue it in the end. And I'm going to learn from these mistakes and try to break through the rating plateau that I've been at for the past couple episodes. Stay tuned for more.